If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. Workplace stalker. I didn't think much of it at first. It started small, like a lot of these things do. Ryan was just another coworker in the office. A little awkward, maybe, but nothing that set off any alarms. He'd ask about my weekend or comment on something I was wearing, like my earrings or a scarf. Stuff that seemed harmless, even friendly. But then, it started to feel different. He started lingering near my desk, finding excuses to chat even when I was obviously busy. If I said I liked something, like a specific coffee or a book, he'd bring it up again and again, almost like he was trying to memorize every detail about me. I remember brushing it off, thinking maybe he was just socially awkward. But deep down, I started feeling uneasy. Things escalated fast. One day, I found a small gift on my desk, a candle with a note that said, "Thought you'd like this. You deserve to relax." No name, but I knew it was from Ryan. I didn't say anything to him, hoping he'd get the message if I just ignored it. But that didn't work. The next day, he cornered me by the coffee machine, asking if I liked the candle. He didn't even try to play it cool. He was smiling in this way that made my skin crawl, like he was proud of himself. I tried to be polite, thanking him but making it clear that gifts weren't necessary. He shrugged and said, "I just like doing nice things for people I care about." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just friendliness. It felt like he was testing the waters, seeing how far he could push. After that, things started to spiral. Ryan seemed to be everywhere I went. If I was in the break room, he'd show up within minutes. If I went to the bathroom, he'd be loitering in the hallway when I came out. It was like he had my schedule memorized. The worst part was how deliberate it all felt. He'd comment on things I hadn't even shared with him, like how I wore my hair differently or that I was walking to work instead of driving. It wasn't casual. It was like he was studying me. I started to avoid him as much as I could, but the office wasn't that big, and it felt like there was no escape. I mentioned it to a coworker, hoping maybe I was overreacting, but they just said, "That's just Ryan. He's harmless." I didn't feel reassured. I decided to talk to my manager when Ryan started texting me after work hours. I never gave him my number, so I had no idea how he got it. The texts weren't outright threatening, but they were unsettling. Things like, "Hope you got home safe," or "You look nice today." He'd always end them with a smiley face, like that made it less creepy. My manager listened and said they'd handle it, but their version of handling it was just a generic conversation with Ryan about professionalism. Afterward, he acted like nothing had happened, but his behavior didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. I started to dread going to work. My heart would race every time I saw him out of the corner of my eye, and I felt like I was constantly looking over my shoulder. One evening, I stayed late to finish up a project, figuring the office would be empty and I could get some peace. But as I was wrapping up, I heard footsteps in the hallway. My stomach sank. It was Ryan. He walked in casually, holding his bag, like he had every reason to be there. "Burning the midnight oil?" he asked, grinning. I forced a smile, muttered something about deadlines, and hoped he'd leave. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned against the doorway, just watching me. The air felt heavy, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I tried to stay calm, grabbing my things as quickly as I could. "Guess I'll call it a night," I said, hoping that would end it. But as I walked past him, he stepped closer, blocking my path for just a moment too long. "You work too hard, you know," he said softly. before finally letting me pass. I practically ran to my car that night, but the feeling of his eyes on me stuck with me the whole way home. After that, I stopped staying late altogether. I started parking closer to the entrance and even switched up my routes to work, hoping to shake the suffocating feeling of being watched. But it didn't matter. Ryan always found a way to insert himself into my day. One morning, I walked in and found another gift on my desk. This time, a framed photo of a sunrise. No note, just the picture. It wasn't until I flipped it over that my stomach dropped. Written on the back was the time and location of the photo. 4:32 a.m. Taken at the trail near my apartment. I felt sick. He had been there, watching me, at a time and place I thought was mine alone. That photo was the breaking point. I went straight to HR, shaking as I explained everything. Every text, every gift, every unsettling encounter. To their credit, they seemed to take it seriously this time. They called Ryan in for a meeting that same day. I didn't know what was said, but I noticed he avoided me for a few days after that. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. I even started to think maybe it was over. But then, a coworker mentioned something offhand that made my blood run cold. "Ryan's been asking if anyone knows your weekend plans," she said, laughing like it was some innocent curiosity. I felt the panic creeping back in. He hadn't stopped. He was just being more careful. That weekend, I decided to stay in and keep my doors locked. I tried to relax, telling myself he wouldn't actually do anything. But late that night, around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Why are your lights off? Are you okay?" I froze. My hands started to shake as I stared at the message. He was outside my apartment. I peeked through the curtains, but I didn't see anyone. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I called the police immediately, explaining everything. They came quickly, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. They told me to file a report, but there wasn't much else they could do since he hadn't actually done anything. After the police left, I didn't sleep. Every sound felt amplified. Every shadow outside my window seemed like him. I didn't know what else to do. The next morning, I called in sick and started looking for a new job. I knew I couldn't keep working there, not with him so close. I felt trapped though, because quitting meant no income, and I didn't have anything lined up yet. But staying felt even more dangerous. By Monday, I forced myself to go in, but the dread weighed on me like a physical thing. When I walked in, Ryan was at his desk, acting completely normal, like nothing had happened. He even smiled at me as I passed. I couldn't believe it. How could someone be so shameless? Then, something happened that I still can't explain. Around lunchtime, Ryan left for what I assumed was his usual break. But when he didn't come back, people started whispering. By the end of the day, we found out that Ryan had just disappeared. His desk was cleared out, and no one seemed to know why. HR wouldn't say much, only that appropriate action had been taken. I should have felt relieved, but instead, it made me even more paranoid. What did that mean? Did they fire him? Was he just waiting outside the building for me? That night, I double-checked all my locks and slept with a knife under my pillow. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. A few weeks passed, and things started to feel normal again. Ryan was gone, and there were no more texts, no gifts, no unsettling run-ins. I kept my guard up, but part of me wanted to believe it was finally over. Then, one evening, as I was heading to my car after work, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Tucked under my windshield wiper was an envelope. My hands were shaking as I opened it, and inside was a single piece of paper with just 4 words. "You'll see me soon." I looked around the parking lot, but it was empty. My heart was racing as I jumped into my car and locked the doors. I drove straight home, checking my rearview mirror the whole way, but there was no sign of anyone following me. I called the police again, and they told me to save the note and stay alert, but without proof of who left it, they couldn't do much. It felt like my life was unraveling. Every time I heard a knock at the door or a car pull up outside, I'd freeze, convinced it was him. But then, nothing. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and Ryan never showed up again. It's been over a year now, and I still don't know what happened to him. Did he finally move on? Was he arrested for something else? Or is he just waiting, biding his time? I try not to think about it too much, but every so often, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, just in case. And every time I find a note or a package on my doorstep, even if it's just from a neighbor, I feel that same icy dread, wondering if this time it's from him. Creepy beach house offer. I'll never forget that weekend at the beach. My friend Jess and I had planned it as a last-minute getaway. Nothing fancy, just some time to relax by the water and escape the monotony of work. We hadn't booked a place to stay ahead of time, figuring we'd find something once we got there. Big mistake. Every hotel and guest house we checked was either fully booked or ridiculously expensive. By late afternoon, we were getting desperate, driving around the quieter streets near the beach when we saw a small handwritten sign stuck to a post. Room for rent, cheap, call for details. Jess rolled her eyes, but I was intrigued. The sign had a phone number and nothing else, which seemed a little odd, but we didn't have many options. I called. A man answered almost immediately, his voice rough and a bit raspy, like someone who'd smoked for years. He said the room was available and gave us an address that turned out to be a rundown beach house tucked behind some overgrown bushes. Two men were waiting for us when we pulled up. One older, probably in his late 50s, with a weathered face and a stooped posture, and the other younger, maybe mid-30s, clean-shaven but with this weird, blank expression. They introduced themselves as Dan and Eric, but something about them felt off. Dan did most of the talking, explaining that the room was upstairs and came with some rules. Jess was already whispering to me that we should leave, but curiosity got the better of me, and I asked what kind of rules. Dan's explanation made my stomach churn, but I tried to keep a neutral face. He said the rules were simple: no going outside after 10 p.m., no visitors under any circumstances, and absolutely no touching the locked door at the end of the upstairs hallway. He said it so casually, as if he was describing house chores. Eric, the younger guy, just stood there the whole time, watching us without blinking. It wasn't a friendly or nervous kind of stare. It was more like he was studying us, trying to figure something out. Jess nudged me again, her signal to leave, but I forced a smile and asked to see the room. I don't even know why. I guess part of me thought I was overreacting, or maybe I just wanted to know what was behind those creepy rules. The house smelled damp, like wet wood and mildew, and the stairs creaked with every step. The room itself wasn't terrible, just small and bare, with a single bed and a dresser. Dan said it was $40 a night, cash only, and gave us this grin that didn't reach his eyes. When I asked about the locked door, he got noticeably tense. "That's private," he said, almost snapping. Then he softened and added, "It's best if you just stick to your room and the downstairs. You'll have everything you need." I looked over at Jess, who was giving me the "I told you so" glare. We left after saying we'd think about it, but the whole thing stuck with me. As we got back into the car, Jess practically shouted, "There is no way we're staying there." I wanted to agree, but a small part of me kept thinking about that locked door. As we drove away, the tension in the car was palpable. Jess kept saying things like, "That place was straight out of a horror movie," and "Did you see the way that younger guy looked at us?" But I couldn't stop replaying Dan's grin and the strange emphasis he put on the rules. Something about it was so unsettling, like there was a hidden threat behind his words. Against my better judgment, I suggested we grab some food and talk it over. Jess groaned but agreed, probably thinking I just needed time to come to my senses. Over burgers at a beachside diner, we debated it. Jess was adamant. It's too weird, way too cheap, and they're obviously hiding something. I didn't disagree, but I kept rationalizing. What if it really was just an old guy renting out a room and we were being paranoid? After dinner, we decided to check one last guest house on the strip. Of course, it was fully booked. By then it was getting dark, and we were out of options. Jess gave me the ultimatum: either sleep in the car or go back to the creepy beach house. I was exhausted and dreading a night cramped in the car, so against every instinct, I convinced her to give it a shot. We'll lock the door, stick together, and leave first thing in the morning, I told her. Reluctantly, she agreed, but the vibe in the car on the way back was heavy. Like we both knew this was a terrible idea but couldn't admit it to ourselves. When we pulled into the driveway again, Dan and Eric were standing outside, as if they had been waiting for us. Dan seemed almost too pleased to see us return, his grin stretching wide as he waved us inside. Eric, on the other hand, just stared again, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Jess whispered, "I hate this already," as we walked in, and I couldn't blame her. The house felt even creepier at night. The single light bulb in the hallway flickered, casting odd shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Dan handed me a key to the room and reminded us, again, about the rules. After 10 p.m., stay in your room. No exceptions, he said firmly, his voice dropping in tone. Eric mumbled something under his breath, and Dan shot him a glare that silenced him instantly. I tried to shrug it off, but my chest felt tight, like I'd just made a huge mistake. Up in the room, Jess was practically pacing, muttering about how we should leave. "It's not worth $40 to be murdered in our sleep," she hissed, but I tried to stay calm. "It's one night," I told her. "We'll leave first thing." She wasn't buying it and kept saying she had a bad feeling. I couldn't argue because I felt it too. The room felt wrong. The faint sound of waves crashing outside, which should have been soothing, somehow added to the unease. Around 9:30, Jess locked the door and jammed a chair under the handle for extra security. We sat there in silence, scrolling on our phones, trying to distract ourselves. But then, just after 10, we heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, and heavier than Dan or Eric had seemed. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. Jess and I froze, exchanging wide-eyed looks, neither of us daring to move. Whoever it was just stood there, and we could hear their faint breathing through the thin wood. Then, a soft tap-tap-tap on the door. Not a knock, more like someone dragging their fingernails lightly against it. Jess clutched my arm so tightly it hurt. I mouthed, "Don't say anything," and we sat there, barely breathing, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. The tapping continued, slow and rhythmic, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might give us away. Finally, after what felt like forever, the footsteps moved on, heading toward the end of the hallway, the locked door. We waited, listening intently. There was a faint creak, like the locked door being opened. My mind raced. Wasn't it supposed to stay locked? Dan had made such a point about it. Jess leaned closer to me and whispered, "We need to leave. Now." I nodded, but before we could move, there was a new sound, something dragging across the floor. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was heavier, uneven, like something being pulled. The sound grew louder, closer, and then stopped again outside our door. Jess was on the verge of tears, and I was gripping the edge of the bed so hard my fingers ached. Whatever was out there wasn't leaving. The sound outside the door shifted again. Slow, deliberate scratching, like claws or something sharp running down the wood. I couldn't take it anymore. My curiosity, mixed with fear, made me reach for my phone to call for help, but when I checked, I realized there was no signal. Jess noticed and shook her head frantically, mouthing, "Turn it off." I hesitated, but then the scratching stopped. Dead silence. For a moment, I thought maybe whoever, or whatever, was out there had gone. But then the doorknob jiggled, slowly at first, and then more forcefully. The chair Jess had wedged under the handle creaked, holding it in place. I grabbed her hand, and we both just stared at the door, waiting for it to burst open. It didn't. Instead, the jiggling stopped, and we heard faint laughter, low, almost guttural, from the hallway. I wanted to run, but how? We couldn't just fling the door open with whatever that was out there. Jess was already packing her bag in a panic, her movements shaky. "We'll climb out the window," she whispered, her voice trembling. It wasn't a bad idea, except the window faced the back of the house, where there was nothing but dense bushes and darkness. Still, anything felt safer than staying in that room. Jess slid the window open as quietly as she could, and we both froze when we heard Dan's voice, muffled but distinct, somewhere downstairs. "What did I say about the rules?" he growled, followed by Eric's voice, quieter, but just as chilling. "They don't listen. They never listen." Hearing their voices downstairs made my blood run cold. Jess was halfway out the window when I grabbed her arm and motioned for her to stop. If they were downstairs, maybe they'd hear us trying to escape. Jess glared at me like I'd lost my mind, but then we both froze again as the dragging sound resumed, now closer than before. Whatever was in the hallway wasn't human. That much I was sure of. It didn't move like a person. The rhythm was off, jerky, and wrong, like someone dragging a sack of wet sand. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. Jess finally whispered, "We can't stay here. I don't care if they hear us. We have to go." I nodded and helped her climb through the window. The drop wasn't far, but the bushes below scratched at our arms and legs as we landed. We crouched low, trying to stay hidden, but my shoe got caught in a root, and I stumbled, crashing into Jess. She shot me a panicked look and whispered, "Keep moving." We crept around the side of the house, staying close to the walls. When we reached the driveway, the faint glow of the porch light gave us just enough visibility to see the car. I was about to sprint for it when Jess grabbed my arm again, her face pale. "Look," she hissed, pointing to the window of our room. Someone, or something, was staring out at us, their face pressed against the glass. We didn't wait to hear more. Jess climbed out first, dropping into the bushes below with a soft thud. I followed, my hands trembling so much it was hard to grip the frame. The air outside was cold, and every rustling leaf sounded deafening in the silence of the night. We crouched low, trying to figure out where to go. The car was parked out front, but we'd have to pass the front door to get to it, and the thought of running into Dan or Eric made my skin crawl. Jess grabbed my arm, pointing toward a narrow path leading away from the house and into the dunes. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only direction that didn't take us closer to the house. We took off, moving as fast as we could without making too much noise. As we ran, the house seemed to come alive behind us. A loud, echoing bang came from inside, like a door slamming. Then we heard shouting, Dan's voice, furious and commanding. "Find them. Don't let them get away." My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just some creepy vibe anymore. We were being hunted. The sand made running difficult, and Jess kept looking over her shoulder, whispering, "They're coming." I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't help it. The house was barely visible now, but there was movement. A figure stepping onto the porch, holding something long and narrow, like a bat or a pipe. We pushed on, our legs burning, and I silently prayed we'd reach the road before they caught up. We finally reached the road, gasping for air and covered in scratches from the bushes. For a moment, I thought we were safe. There were a few streetlights, and the sight of them felt almost comforting. But then, in the distance, I saw headlights flicker on. Jess saw it too and grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the side of the road. "They're in the car," she hissed, panic flooding her voice. I couldn't think straight. My mind was stuck on the realization that they must have known we'd tried to escape. Jess pulled me down behind a low dune, and we crouched there, listening as the car engine roared to life. The sound of it got louder as they drove up the road, moving slowly like they were searching. We stayed as still as possible, the only sounds our labored breathing and the faint hum of the car. It passed by, but not for long. They must have noticed the path through the dunes because the car stopped, and I heard a door slam. Then another. Voices followed, though I couldn't make out the words. Jess squeezed my hand, her nails digging into my skin as the footsteps started again. They were coming closer. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest. Every instinct screamed to run, but where? If we moved, they'd hear us for sure. Jess whispered, "Stay low. Don't move." I nodded, terrified, as the footsteps passed dangerously close, crunching the sand just feet away from where we hid. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, I thought they'd found us. I held my breath, every muscle in my body locked up with fear. Then I heard Dan's voice again, low and menacing. "They're around here. I can feel it." My stomach churned, and I could see Jess biting her lip so hard it looked like it might bleed. Another voice, Eric's, responded, but it was muffled, almost like he was nervous. "Maybe they went back to the road?" Dan snapped back, "No. They wouldn't risk it." Their voices grew softer as they moved further down the path, but I didn't trust it. I tugged Jess's sleeve, motioning for us to crawl back toward the road, sticking close to the dunes for cover. It felt like it took forever, but we finally made it to the edge of the road again. We could see the faint glow of the headlights in the distance. Further down the path they were searching. Jess tugged my arm, pointing toward a cluster of small cottages about 100 yards away. "If we get there, we can hide," she whispered. I nodded, but just as we started to move, a loud whistle cut through the night air. It wasn't Dan or Eric. It was sharper, shrill, and it came from behind us, back near the house. My blood ran cold as I turned to look. There, silhouetted in the distance, was a third figure, tall, motionless, and holding something long in their hand. They were watching us. Jess saw the figure too and froze, her grip on my arm tightening. "Run," she whispered, barely audible, but I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted toward the cottages, our feet pounding against the asphalt. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear shouting behind us. Dan's voice, furious and closer than I expected. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but the sight of those cottages kept me moving. When we reached the first one, Jess banged on the door, shouting for help. There was no answer. The windows were dark, and the whole place looked deserted. She tried the handle, but it was locked tight. "Next one," I gasped, and we ran again, our panic growing with every step. As we approached the second cottage, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The headlights were back, bouncing wildly as the car sped up the road. Worse, I saw two figures running behind it, Dan and Eric, their silhouettes unmistakable. We reached the next cottage, but it was the same story. Locked, dark, and empty. Jess let out a frustrated sob, but I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the side of the building to hide. We crouched low, pressing ourselves against the wall, trying to catch our breath. The sound of the car grew louder, and soon the headlights swept over the cottages, illuminating everything. We were exposed. Jess clutched my hand, her face pale with terror, as the car screeched to a halt just a few feet away. The car doors slammed, and heavy footsteps hit the pavement. Dan's voice rang out, rough and commanding. "We know you're here. You can't run forever." Jess and I flattened ourselves against the wall, trying to make ourselves invisible, but it was useless. The headlights illuminated the entire area, and I could hear them splitting up, their footsteps crunching in opposite directions. Eric's voice came next, softer but somehow creepier. "Come on, it'll be easier if you just come out." My chest felt like it would explode from the pressure, every breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Jess was trembling beside me, her nails digging into my arm. I whispered, "We have to move," but she shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. Before I could say anything else, a shadow moved across the corner of the building. Dan appeared, his face twisted into a cruel grin, and in his hand was a crowbar. "There you are," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Jess screamed and bolted before I could stop her, sprinting toward the road. Dan lunged after her, leaving me frozen in terror. But then I heard it, a deep, guttural growl from the direction of the house. It wasn't human. Even Dan stopped in his tracks, looking back toward the beach house with wide eyes. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of wood splintering. Whatever was locked behind that door was out, and it was coming. The sound of splintering would grew louder, followed by a strange, dragging noise, like something massive was being pulled across the ground. Dan stood frozen for a moment, staring toward the house, before yelling, "Eric, get over here." His voice cracked, fear seeping through his usual bravado. Jess had stopped running too, looking back at me with wide, terrified eyes. I wanted to yell for her to keep going, but I couldn't find my voice. My entire body felt paralyzed as the growl turned into something more, a guttural, almost wet-sounding roar that echoed across the dunes. Then we saw it. At first, it was just a shadow emerging from the direction of the house, massive and misshapen. As it got closer, the dim headlights revealed something I still can't explain. It was tall, hunched over, with limbs too long for its body and a face that seemed to shift every time I tried to focus on it. Its skin, or whatever covered it, was pale and glistening, like it was wet. Dan dropped the crowbar and started backing away, muttering, "No, no, this isn't right." Eric appeared from the other side of the cottages, his face pale as a ghost. "You said it wouldn't come out," he stammered, his voice trembling. Dan didn't answer. Instead, he turned and bolted for the car, leaving Eric standing there, frozen in fear. For a moment, everything stopped. Even Dan, who had been so aggressive seconds ago, just stood there, staring back at the house. Jess had slowed down too, frozen in place on the edge of the road. The growl turned into a low rumble, and then there was another noise, a dragging sound, heavy and wet, like something enormous pulling itself forward. Dan cursed under his breath and started backing up, shouting for Eric. "Get back here. We've got a problem." Eric's voice came from somewhere near the cottages, frantic and terrified. "What the hell is that?" he yelled. I didn't wait to find out. I ran toward Jess, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the road. "Let's go," I screamed, but she was barely moving, her eyes locked on the house. As we stumbled onto the pavement, I couldn't resist looking back. Something huge was emerging from the house, its shape impossible to make out in the dim light, but it was dark and hulking, and its movement didn't seem natural. Dan and Eric were both yelling now, but their words were drowned out by a deafening roar. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't interested in us, it was focused on them. Dan swung the crowbar wildly, but it was useless. In the chaos, Jess and I bolted down the road, not daring to stop or look back again. The sounds behind us, the roaring, the screams, faded as we ran, but they haunted us, echoing in my ears long after we were far away. We didn't stop running until we were back near the main strip of the beach town, where the lights from the shops and restaurants felt like a lifeline. Jess collapsed onto a bench, sobbing uncontrollably, while I stood there, shaking, trying to catch my breath. I fumbled for my phone and finally got a signal. I wanted to call the police, tell someone what had happened, but how could I even explain it? Creepy guys at a beach house? Something monstrous came out of a locked room? It sounded insane, even to me. Jess finally choked out. What the hell was that? I didn't have an answer. All I could do was wrap my arms around her and try to calm her down, though I wasn't sure if I was comforting her or myself. We left town at sunrise, not daring to wait around for answers. On the way home, we barely spoke, both of us too shaken to process what had happened. The weirdest part? A few days later, I searched online for any news about the house. Fires, missing persons, anything, but there was nothing. No reports, no mentions, not even the address on any rental listings. It was like the place didn't exist. Jess refuses to talk about it, and honestly, I don't blame her. But every now and then, I catch myself thinking about that night, wondering what was really behind that door, and why Dan and Eric were so desperate to keep it hidden. Dorm room intruder or ghost? I was in my second year at university when this happened, living in a small dorm apartment just off campus. It wasn't much, one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a shared bathroom at the end of the hall. But it was mine, and I loved it for the independence it gave me. I was juggling classes, part-time work at a bookstore, and a never-ending pile of assignments, so my days were busy. Most nights, I'd fall asleep with my laptop open, halfway through an essay or a show I was too tired to finish. That night was no different. It was late October, and the first cold snap of the season had hit. I'd gone to bed in sweatpants and a hoodie, wrapped in my scratchy dorm blanket, with the sound of the wind rattling the window keeping me company. I remember checking my phone, 12:37 a.m., before I drifted off. The next thing I knew, I woke up suddenly, that kind of waking where you don't know what pulled you out of sleep, but you're instantly wide awake. My dorm was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I wasn't scared at first, just annoyed. I thought maybe my upstairs neighbors were moving furniture again, as they always seem to do at odd hours. Then I noticed something strange. The kitchen light was on. I was sure I had turned it off before bed. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd left it on after getting a glass of water. But then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone's fingers drumming on a countertop. I froze in bed, my heart pounding so hard I was sure whoever, or whatever, was out there could hear it. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, and with each sound, my brain ran through every possibility. Could it be one of my neighbors? No, my door was locked. Maybe maintenance, but they wouldn't show up unannounced in the middle of the night. My hands were clammy as I reached for my phone, but then I realized I'd left it on the kitchen counter earlier that evening. Swearing under my breath, I sat up as quietly as I could, straining my ears for any other noise. The tapping stopped. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing, that it was some dream bleeding into reality. But then I heard it again. This time, it was the sound of someone shifting their weight, the faint creak of the kitchen counter. I had to see what was going on. My dorm wasn't big. There was no hiding space for anyone except under the sink or on top of the counter itself. I grabbed the only thing within arm's reach, an empty water bottle, and tiptoed toward the doorway. Peeking out, my breath caught in my throat. There, sitting cross-legged on the kitchen counter, was a figure. They were shrouded in shadows, illuminated only by the dim yellow glow of the overhead light, and they didn't move. I couldn't make out their face at first, but they were sitting unnaturally still, their head tilted slightly, like they were listening for something. My knees felt weak, and for a second, I thought about bolting out of the dorm, but I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the floor as my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing. They didn't look like any of my neighbors, and there was something off about them. Their arms seemed too long, almost out of proportion to their body, and their fingers were drumming on the counter in that same rhythmic pattern I'd heard before. It was hypnotic, like they were keeping time to some silent song only they could hear. "Who are you?" I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure stopped drumming. Slowly, they turned their head toward me, and that's when I finally saw their face, or more accurately, the lack of one. Where their features should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin, like an unfinished mannequin. I stumbled backward, knocking into the door frame, and the figure tilted its head even more, as if studying me. My stomach churned, and a cold sweat broke out over my body. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure didn't move toward me, didn't make a sound. It just sat there, watching, or maybe sensing me. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in this standoff with whatever that thing was. Seconds, minutes. It felt like hours. My mind raced through every explanation I could think of, but none of them made sense. It wasn't human, at least, not entirely. But it didn't feel ghostly either. There was a weight to its presence, a realness that sent chills down my spine. Finally, my survival instinct kicked in. I needed to get out. Slowly, trying not to make any sudden moves, I inched backward toward my bedroom. The floor creaked under my weight, and I froze, expecting the figure to lunge at me, but it didn't. It just kept sitting there, its faceless head following my movements like a predator watching prey. Once I was back in my room, I shut the door as quietly as I could and wedged a chair under the doorknob. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage it. I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon, but all I had was my backpack, a desk lamp, and some textbooks. My phone. I needed my phone. It was still on the kitchen counter, right next to that thing. I wanted to cry, but fear had numbed my emotions. I kept telling myself this wasn't real, that I was dreaming, but every sound, the hum of the fridge, the faint creaks of the old building, kept pulling me back to the horrifying reality that I wasn't alone. I don't know what gave me the courage, or the sheer desperation, but I decided I couldn't just sit there. I needed to know if it was still out there, and I needed my phone. I pulled my desk lamp from the wall, gripping it tightly like a makeshift club, and crept back to the door. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it would give me away. Slowly, I leaned down to peer through the gap under the door. The light from the kitchen spilled into the hall, casting long shadows, but I couldn't see any movement. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. If I opened the door, there was no going back. I swallowed hard and braced myself, then slowly eased the door open just enough to peek out. The kitchen was exactly as I'd left it, the overhead light buzzing faintly. But the counter? It was empty. My breath hitched. I scanned the small space, my eyes darting to every corner, every shadow, but the figure was gone. For a split second, relief washed over me. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was some half-awake hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But then I saw it. My phone, right where I'd left it, and next to it, the unmistakable imprint of two long, slender handprints pressed into the dust on the counter. I felt my stomach drop, my relief instantly replaced by a creeping dread. Those handprints weren't human. Not exactly. The fingers were too long, the palms too narrow, and there was something about the way they were positioned, as if whoever or whatever left them had been crouched unnaturally on the counter. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to step into the kitchen. The closer I got to my phone, the more the air seemed to thicken around me, like the room itself was holding its breath. Every instinct told me to leave it and run, but I couldn't. I needed to call someone, anyone, to tell them what was happening. I snatched my phone and immediately backed toward my room, my eyes darting around the space as if the figure would suddenly reappear. My fingers fumbled as I tried to unlock the screen, my vision blurring from the adrenaline surging through me. But just as I pressed the emergency call button, The kitchen light flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed the room, and in that instant, I heard it, the faintest sound of breathing. It wasn't coming from the kitchen. It was behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as that shallow, raspy breathing filled my ears. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to know what was there, but it was like some magnetic force compelled me. Slowly, with my heart slamming against my ribs, I turned my head. The hallway was pitch black, but I could feel it. Something standing there, watching me. My thumb hovered over the call button on my phone, but before I could press it, the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. And then, a whisper. Not words, exactly. More like a low, guttural sound that crawled under my skin and lodged itself in my bones. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted, slamming the door to my bedroom shut behind me and throwing myself against it. My hands scrambled to shove the chair back under the doorknob, my phone clattering to the floor in the process. My lungs burned as I tried to catch my breath, but I couldn't stop shaking. Whatever it was still out there, and it knew I was trapped. I sat there for what felt like hours, pressed against the door, clutching the desk lamp in one hand like it was my last line of defense. My phone lay on the floor, screen cracked but still glowing faintly. I wanted to call someone, security, a friend, anyone, but I couldn't bring myself to move. What if it heard me? What if it was waiting for me to make a mistake? The silence in the dorm was unbearable. Even the usual creaks and groans of the old building seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a suffocating stillness. Finally, I reached for my phone, my movements painfully slow and deliberate. I managed to unlock it and dial campus security. The line rang twice before a voice picked up. "Campus security," a man said, his voice calm and routine, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. I whispered into the phone, barely able to get the words out. "There's someone in my dorm. I think they're still here." The guard asked for my location, and I gave it to him, my voice trembling. He assured me someone would be there in minutes, but those minutes felt like an eternity. I stayed pressed against the door, listening for any sign of movement outside. Minutes stretched on like hours, and every second felt like a battle to keep myself from spiraling. My ears strained for any sound, any indication that the thing outside was still there, but all I heard was my own ragged breathing. Then, faintly, I caught the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway. Relief surged through me. Security must have arrived. I got up, hesitated, and cracked the door open just a fraction. The hallway was dimly lit, the bulb flickering at the far end, but I could see a figure approaching. "Thank God," I whispered, stepping into the doorway. "I'm in here." The figure didn't respond. It kept moving toward me, slow and deliberate, and as it came into view, my relief dissolved into sheer terror. It wasn't the guard. It was the thing from before. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like a puppet being forced into motion. That faceless head tilted slightly, and I swore I saw the faintest outline of a smile, something impossible and wrong, emerging from the blankness. My body acted before my brain could catch up. I slammed the door shut and threw myself against it again, screaming into the phone still clutched in my hand. "Hurry! It's here! It's here!" Christmas Eve kidnap attempt. Christmas Eve always felt magical to me, but that night it turned into something I'd only expect to see in a nightmare. I had just left a late dinner at my friend's house, full from the feast and humming along to the Christmas music playing in my car. It was around 11 p.m., and the streets were unusually quiet. I live in a small town, so I'm used to that eerie stillness, but something about that night felt off. As I pulled up to the intersection near the old church, I noticed a woman standing by the corner. She was waving her arms frantically, as if she needed help. At first, I thought her car might have broken down or she was lost, so I slowed down and rolled down my window slightly. She was in her mid-30s, dressed in a coat that looked a little too thin for the cold, and her face was flushed red, either from the cold or crying. It was hard to tell. She told me her name, though I've since forgotten it, and she said she needed a ride just a few blocks down the road to her house. I hesitated. Something about the situation felt strange. Her voice was shaky, but it didn't sound scared, more like she was trying too hard to sound desperate. Still, it was Christmas Eve, and I couldn't just leave her out there in the freezing cold. I agreed, but told her I could only drop her at the corner of her street since I didn't know her. She nodded, but I swear I saw a flicker of annoyance cross her face before she smiled again. As she got into the car, I immediately noticed something strange. She didn't seem cold. Her hands weren't shaking, her breath wasn't visible in the freezing air, and there was no snow on her boots despite the fresh layer on the ground. She told me her house was only 5 minutes away and started directing me, but her instructions didn't make sense. She'd say to turn left, then quickly change her mind to right, all while glancing at her phone as if checking GPS. At one point, I asked her if she was sure she knew where she lived, and she gave me this strained laugh, saying, "Of course. It's just hard to explain." By now, my stomach was knotting up. The streetlights were getting fewer and farther between, and the houses were more spaced out, almost disappearing into the trees. She asked if I could drive just a little farther, insisting her house was right there. I stopped the car, saying I wouldn't go any further until she gave me a clear address. Her demeanor shifted instantly. The nervous, shivering woman from the street corner was gone, replaced with someone much colder. She leaned in closer to me, her voice low and steady now, and said, "Just a little further. Trust me, it's safe." That's when I noticed her phone wasn't even on. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was seriously wrong. I reached for my phone to pretend I was checking the time, but really, I wanted to have it in my hand in case I needed to call for help. That's when I noticed a faint glow from the woods ahead. Headlights, maybe? It wasn't coming from a house, though. It was deeper into the trees, where there shouldn't have been any roads. She noticed me looking and said, almost too casually, "Oh, my friends must have left the porch light on for me." Her voice had this edge to it now, like she was trying to keep me calm. My pulse was racing, and I muttered something about needing to turn around. As I reached for the gear shift, she grabbed my wrist. Her grip was shockingly strong, and her nails dug into my skin. "You can't leave yet," she said, her voice almost a whisper, but there was no pleading in it, just a cold finality. That was it for me. I yanked my arm free and threw the car into reverse, but as I started to back up, I saw movement in the rearview mirror. A man stepped out from behind the trees, walking toward my car with a slow, deliberate pace. My blood ran cold. He wasn't running. He didn't need to. He looked like he knew I was trapped. I slammed the car into drive and sped forward, not caring where the road led as long as it got me away from them. The woman started shouting, her voice shrill now, but I couldn't make out what she was saying. She was trying to grab the wheel, her fingers clawing at my hands. I jerked the car to the side, and she lost her balance, slamming against the door. For a moment, I thought she might open it and jump out, but instead, she turned to me with this wild, almost animalistic look in her eyes and hissed, "You're making a mistake." The headlights from the woods were moving now, weaving between the trees, and I realized there wasn't just one light, there were several. More people, maybe cars, were coming from the woods, heading toward the road. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I veered onto the first turn I could find. It wasn't a real road, just a dirt path barely wide enough for my car, but I didn't care. The woman was still thrashing in the passenger seat, screaming at me to stop. Then, suddenly, she went quiet. I glanced over and saw her staring ahead, her face pale and blank like she'd seen a ghost. For a split second, I wondered if I should stop the car and push her out, but I didn't want to risk it. Whatever she had seen clearly terrified her, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out why. I kept driving, the path getting bumpier and harder to navigate. My headlights barely cut through the thick trees, and every shadow looked like it was moving. Then, without warning, she started laughing, this low, unsettling chuckle that sent a chill through me. "You can't run from them," she said, her voice almost playful now. "They'll find you. They always do." I snapped, yelling at her to shut up, but she didn't stop. She was rocking back and forth in her seat, muttering to herself and occasionally bursting into that eerie laughter. That's when I saw it, something darting between the trees ahead. It wasn't a person, at least not like any person I'd ever seen. It moved too fast, almost on all fours, and its eyes reflected the light from my headlights in a way that made my stomach churn. I slammed the brakes, my car skidding to a stop. The woman turned to me, her face serious again, and said, "You should have just let them take you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know what she meant, and I didn't want to find out. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there, but my car was stuck. The wheels had sunk into the loose dirt, and every attempt to move only made them spin uselessly. The woman just sat there now, completely still, staring out the windshield as if she were waiting for something. I begged her to help me push the car, but she didn't even flinch. "It's too late," she muttered, almost to herself. Panic set in as I saw more movement in the trees. Shapes, humanoid but wrong, were circling the car. Their limbs were too long, their movements too jerky, like marionettes controlled by an unsteady hand. I locked the doors and tried calling 911, but I had no signal. The woman started humming, a slow, tuneless sound that made my skin crawl. "They like it when you're scared," she said softly, finally looking at me again. Her eyes didn't look human anymore. Too dark, too empty. "You're feeding them." I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the steering wheel. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do, but every option felt hopeless. The shapes outside the car were getting closer, and their faces, or what I assumed were faces, were still hidden in the shadows. I honked the horn, desperate to scare them off, but the sound barely seemed to faze them. That's when one of them lunged toward the passenger side of the car, slamming a hand, or a claw, against the window. The glass didn't break, but the sound of it made my whole body jolt. The woman smiled, almost like she was enjoying the chaos. "You should have listened," she said calmly. "I couldn't take it anymore." Without thinking, I unbuckled my seatbelt, grabbed the door handle, and flung it open. My plan was half-formed: run into the woods, call for help, anything to get away from her and whatever was out there. But before I could step out, something grabbed my ankle from under the car. The grip was ice-cold and impossibly strong, yanking me down so hard I nearly fell face-first into the dirt. I screamed and kicked, trying to break free, but it wouldn't let go. I kicked harder, my foot connecting with something solid, and the grip loosened just enough for me to scramble back into the car and slam the door shut. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. I locked the doors again and tried to catch my breath, but the woman started laughing hysterically, her head thrown back like she was enjoying the show. "You're not going anywhere," she said between fits of laughter. I yelled at her to get out, but she didn't move. Her gaze shifted back to the windshield, and her laughter stopped as abruptly as it started. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. I looked up and froze. The shapes had emerged from the shadows, surrounding the car completely. They were tall, impossibly thin, their bodies bent at unnatural angles. Their faces were featureless, just smooth, pale surfaces that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. They didn't move, just stood there, staring, or at least I thought they were staring. The woman leaned closer to me, her cold breath brushing against my ear, and said, They've chosen you. I couldn't process what she meant. I didn't want to. All I knew was that I had to get out of there, no matter what. I floored the gas pedal, but the car didn't budge. The wheels spun uselessly in the dirt, and the engine roared, but it was like the car was stuck in cement. The figures started moving again, closing in on all sides. One of them pressed its hand against the driver's side window, its impossibly long fingers leaving smudges that looked like frost. I could feel the cold seeping into the car, the air growing heavier with every second. Suddenly, the woman grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "It's no use," she hissed, her voice sharper now, almost inhuman. "You're theirs now." I shoved her hand away, yelling for her to get out of the car, but she just smiled that eerie, lifeless smile. Then, as if on cue, the figures all moved at once. They pressed against the car, their faceless heads tilting in unison, like they were examining me. The air inside the car felt suffocating, thick and freezing at the same time. And then, just as I thought they were about to break through, everything stopped. The silence was deafening. The figures stepped back, disappearing into the trees as quickly as they had appeared, like shadows melting into darkness. The air warmed instantly, and I could suddenly breathe again. My car jolted forward as if whatever had been holding it back had let go. I didn't question it. I slammed on the gas and sped down the dirt path, not caring where it led as long as it was away from that nightmare. The woman, however, didn't even flinch. She just sat there, calm and still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When I reached the main road, I pulled over and turned to scream at her to get out, but the passenger seat was empty. My heart stopped. The door was still locked, and there was no sign of her anywhere. The only thing left was the faint smell of something metallic, like rust or blood. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to convince myself it was over. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that they're still watching me, waiting for the right moment to finish what they started.